Hello, Year 10 historians. Today we're going to be talking about the road to reconciliation. Reconciliation is the mending or creating friendly ties between two groups, and we're talking about European, white Australians, and Indigenous people. Let's get stuck in. Your learning goals, should you choose to accept them, which you must. 1, you're going to know what reconciliation is. 2, you're going to know what the Redfern speech is. Hint, it's a speech given by Paul Keating in a suburb called Redfern in Sydney. And 3, you're going to be able to take a historical perspective. Let's do it. Okay, so what is reconciliation? It is the restoration of friendly relations. That's its definition. It's really a single event, yeah? So it's more a sum of special moments that together heal the hurt. So reconciliation is not going to happen in one go. It's going to take a whole lot of effort. And because a lot of the negativity that happened between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians, reconciliation is a road, very long. So here is the Reconciliation Australia website. It's a government website. So there's all kinds of stuff there about National Reconciliation Week. Narangawali, that is the forum for reconciliation in schools. Reconciliation action plans, blah, blah, blah. Their purpose is to inspire and enable all Australians to contribute to the reconciliation of the nation. Lovely. And there are 5 dimensions to it: race relations, equality, inequity, unity, institutional integrity, which is about parts of government pretty much, and historical acceptance. There you go. Very interesting looking website. The Redfern speech. In 1992, Prime Minister Paul Keating acknowledged the harm caused to Indigenous people from previous government policies. Yep. Let's have a look at some of that speech. There he is, the man himself, Paul Keating. We cannot imagine that the descendants of people whose genius and resilience maintained a culture here through 50,000 years or more, through cataclysmic changes to the climate and environment, and who then survived 2 centuries of dispossession and abuse, will be denied their place in the modern Australian nation. We cannot imagine that. We cannot imagine that we will fail. Some hopeful words there, saying, look at these amazing people. They've survived. They've lived here for it's more like 80,000 years, plus 200 years of having all their stuff stolen and being murdered and abused and discriminated against. They need their place in the modern Australian nation. This is an ongoing project, mind you. We're still trying to get a recognition of Indigenous people included in the Australian Constitution, and it's not happening at the moment. Hopefully it will. So the impact the speech had on Indigenous people. It says Aboriginals. I didn't write this slide, I just included it. This is quite interesting. So the Redfern speech by Paul Keating, the Labor Prime Minister, was voted as number 3 in the national poll as the most unforgettable speech of all time. Only behind Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. And one other one. Yeah, the speech put reconciliation on the agenda. Yeah, it really awakened people's eyes to thinking, whoa, hey, maybe, okay, there's been some historical injustice done to Indigenous people. We need reconciliation. We need to do something about it. It paved the way for the formal apology that happened much later, delivered by Kevin Rudd. Anyway, and as that person said, one of the most significant speeches ever delivered by an Australian political leader. Speeches do make a difference, yeah? It's symbolic reconciliation, but it's still important. Symbols are important. So as part of Australia's protection policy, they had a policy, an assimilation policy, they had a policy of taking Indigenous children with mixed parents, mixed race parents or whatever, taking them out of their families and making them go and live with white families and be brought up as white Australians, right? Shocking. Now, a government report was commissioned on this topic, and it was released, and it was called Bringing Them Home Report. That was released in 1997, and it was a report into what is called the stolen generations, stolen from their parents. It detailed the process of how children were taken from their families for protection, and it talked about how those who were taken were still very, very negatively affected, more likely to be depressed, be poor, be involved with crime, and have low education. It made some recommendations. It said, look, you've done this bad, these people are still being negatively affected, here are some recommendations. There should be funding to record this history, this cannot be forgotten. Reparations, it recommended reparations, like giving money to the people who were affected, who were stolen from their families. And it recommended an apology. Were all of those things done? No. Here is the cover of the report, Bringing Them Home, a guide to the findings and recommendations of the National Inquiry into the Separation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Children from Their Families. That's the long title. There you go. Okay, historical perspectives. I want you to write one short sentence from the perspective of each group on the topic of reconciliation between Indigenous Australians and the rest of Australians. Indigenous and non-Indigenous, okay? So one short sentence, what would be this perspective about reconciliation for Indigenous people? What might their perspective be? The government, what might the government's perspective be? A new migrant from China coming in and seeing all of this? And then I want you to write what your own perspective is. Okay. Our first video is Paul Keating's Redfern speech from 1992. Check it out.
It now gives me great pleasure to introduce the Prime Minister of Australia, Mr. Paul Keating, to officially launch the International Year of the World's Indigenous People.
Sol, the Mayor of South Sydney, Vic Smith, my ministerial colleague Robert Tickner, the Leader of the Opposition and his Deputy, Bob Carr and Andrew F. Shorgie, distinguished members of Parliament, guests, ladies and gentlemen. That is perhaps the point of this year of the world's Indigenous people, to bring the dispossessed out of the shadows, to recognise that they are part of us, that we cannot give Indigenous Australians up without giving up many of our own deeply held values, much of our identity, and indeed our own humanity. The starting point might be to recognise that the problem starts with us, the non-Aboriginal Australians. It begins, I think, with an act of recognition. Recognition that it was we who did the dispossessing. We took the traditional lands and smashed the traditional way of life. We brought the diseases and the alcohol. We committed the murders. We took the children from their mothers. We practiced discrimination and exclusion. It was our ignorance and our prejudice and our failure to imagine that these things could be done to us. But there's one thing today we cannot imagine. We cannot imagine that the descendants of people whose genius and resilience maintained a culture here through 50,000 years or more, through cataclysmic changes to the climate and the environment, and who then survived 2 centuries of dispossession and abuse, will be denied their place in the modern Australian nations. We can't imagine that. We cannot imagine that we'll fail. And with the spirit that is here today, I'm confident that we won't fail. I'm confident we will succeed in this decade. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Today's second video is entitled Reconciling Australia. Take it away.
Indigenous Australians are the oldest continuous civilization in the world. Their rich culture stretches back tens of thousands of years. But many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children were stripped of their culture by a government policy that removed them from their families and placed them into white foster care. They are known as the Stolen Generations. In 2008, the Prime Minister offered a formal apology for what he called a blemished chapter in the nation's history.
For the pain, suffering and hurt of these stolen generations, their descendants and for their families left behind, we say sorry. To the mothers and the fathers, the brothers and the sisters, for the breaking up of families and communities, we say sorry. And for the indignity and degradation thus inflicted on a proud people and a proud culture, we say sorry.
The apology was hailed as a key step on the path to reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. In the same year, an ambitious set of targets was established to close the gap in disadvantage between the two groups. They cover areas including education, employment and health. The government's own report card this year admits it is not on track to reduce the gap in life expectancy. It is not on track to improve school attendance among Indigenous students. And it won't achieve goals for reading and maths or employment rates among Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders.
I can advise the House that 3 of the 7 Closing the Gap targets are on track this year, giving us the most promising results since 2011. The solution to closing the gap rests within the imagination, the ingenuity, the passion and the drive of Indigenous people themselves. Government must be the enabler of this success.
It's now a decade since the national apology and the ambitious plan to improve Indigenous lives was launched. Is it time for a new approach to achieve real equality for Australia's First Peoples? Natalie Pohonen, The Newsmakers.
Okay, today's reflection activity. The road to reconciliation was the topic of today's lesson. I want you to summarise today's lesson in exactly 12 words. Do it! Yay! Yay! It's homework time. I'm excited. Question. How can a speech help reconciliation? Write a short answer to that question. Another question. How can a government report lead to reconciliation? Write a short answer to that question as well. For those of you that are keen as beans, I want you to read chapter 4.11 in your History Alive 10 textbook. Thank you so much for taking part in today's lesson, and as I always say, keep it real.